So,
Oh. Okay.
it makes you nervous if I start recording.
Yeah. Okay. Well, now it's recording, so we just have to go now.
You have no option. No. Well, thank you for doing this.
Yeah. Thanks for asking me.
Yeah. How you doing?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm okay. We should probably explain what we're doing.
Okay. Do you want to explain, or do you want me to explain?
Well, why don't we alternate? I mean, part of the thing here is that I will talk and you will talk.
Okay. Thank you.
No,
Okay. I have some experience in podcasts. I know.
We should get that down as a ground rule.
Mm-hmm,
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so we decided to do a podcast. Just record this. See how it goes, because we met on Twitter quite a while ago. This is my story. Met on Twitter quite a while ago and became friends. We really have quite a few similar perspectives, I think, and have had a lot of similar formative experiences. And our conversations, I thought, were just so good, I thought we should record them and share them.
Is it my turn now?
It is your turn.
Is this what, okay, this is my turn. We just somehow our circles overlapped on Twitter, some months ago, and we just engaged about all the topics that are of interest to us: philosophy, theology,
basically
everything, rejecting modernity, all those things, coziness, which is what we're going to talk about, I think, later. And we've talked about doing a podcast for a little while, and now we're actually doing it. Which the timing is on the heels of my suspension. So
yes, which we'll talk about in just a second. But I thought we should say we may do more of these. I posted about it on Twitter, and there was interest. I know people sent us questions and all this, and basically we're just going to ignore all those for this episode, I think.
But not because they're not important. They're so important. They're very important questions.
And yes, but a couple things happened. For the last 2 weeks, I've been struggling with this thing, COVID-19. I don't know if you've heard about that. I think it's
I had it. I know about it.
Yes, you've had it more than once, haven't you?
Yes, I had it when it first hit the States in early 2020. Then I had it. Yeah, and then I had it back in December.
I had it in February of 2020, before it was cool.
Oh,
right.
That does seem like something you would do, like get COVID before everybody else did.
Right,
so
right. Be on the cutting edge of of respiratory illness. Yeah. Okay. So anyway,
put that little feather in your cap.
Right. I mean, one of the many things we taught, I've told you, like, ever since I was a teenager, I was on the cutting edge of cool.
Right.
I mean, and anybody, I think, who reads my Twitter feed would be like, this is a guy who's obsessed with nothing but novelty and coolness. Right. Anyway, so I don't know what the future of this will be, but I mean, I assume we will do more than one of these and may become a regular thing.
We'll see. We have to answer the questions.
We have to do at least 2 episodes.
Yeah, we have to at least do 2.
Right. Okay.
So.
All right. So that's the that's kind of the structure. Now, when I get this edited and it's ready to release, you will not be tweeting it.
Unless some ban has been lifted. I'm trying to not hold out hope. I'm being cautiously optimistic, because there are people who are working very hard to have me reinstated, and it's kind of out of my hands at this point. My fate lies in the hands of more influential people than I am, and organizations and Twitter.
Right. So the story in brief is what today is Tuesday. So it was like last Thursday that you.
Yes.
Right. And you basically texted me and sent me a screenshot of your ban, right?
Yeah.
And so it's it's been like 5 days since you were
Mhm.
suspended. Well, you weren't
Mhm.
suspended, you were banned permanently.
Yeah, permanently suspended. Mhm.
Right. I guess we should say that it's not because of anything that, you didn't break the rules. Uh,
Correct.
right. But it's because of your association with uh, your organization.
Right.
The
Which they're reinstated, so they're good to go. Just me and Quinn, the social media director, who do a lot of like tweeting and just media, like from the chalkboard account.
right.
So she and I are almost always logged into it, just because we're doing media and promoting, you know, articles and that kind of thing.
Mhm.
So whenever chalkboard was taken down, when they were suspended, she and I both got taken down too because we were logged in essentially.
Right.
And there was some other stuff that went on. I won't go into detail, but Quinn and I were never cited a violation. We have no idea. Chalkboard is back up again. We were never cited a violation. We have no idea of what rules they're claiming that she and I broke. Chalkboard was given something, but it does not pertain to me or Quinn, and we're just kind of now at the mercy of Twitter.
I know you. I know you've seen how much interest your suspension has generated.
Yes, I did see that. And I think it's I think everybody in our side of Twitter, on our side of Twitter, they really are trying to promote freedom of thought, diversity of thought when it comes to education. And the NEA, the teachers union, they specifically, I mean, Fox ran an article on it. They specifically wanted Twitter to target education outlets that were opposed to the teachers unions.
Right.
And Chalkboard was one of the first ones to be taken down in that targeted attack
Mhm.
on free on school choice and just educational diversity.
Right.
So I was just a collateral damage in that whole takedown.
Yeah. Well, what's your response been to, okay, so you made a little video. It's been viewed like 21,000 times.
Mm-hmm.
So there's so much.
Where I didn't even talk about education.
Right.
I didn't even say anything about anything.
We talked about your dessert preferences.
Yes, lemon and blueberry.
So there's a lot of energy around your suspension. A lot of people very concerned about it. Because, I think it's because people obviously feel connected to you, but also because so many of your tweets consist of, reports about bunnies or jokes or your desire to have a dragon or how you like to eat cheese, right?
Right.
I think it's a little bit frightening to people if they think, well, if they'll take down Godward, they'll take down anybody.
Yeah, I think that's the sentiment. I think that's how people are feeling, like, wow, none of us are safe if she can be taken down in some, larger takedown. How many of us would be guilty by association if a bigger organization were taken down? So I think that's everyone's concern, and I think that's a good concern to have. There's lots of people who have made Twitter the public square,
Right.
and that's where people come to share ideas, to debate. It's a very intellectual space in my mind.
Depends on where you are, I guess.
It depends on where you are. I mean, I'm sure. I mean, there are people out there who post stupid stuff. But can I say stupid stuff? I mean, some people post stupid stuff.
People, even worse than stupid stuff.
Yeah, it's vulgar, and you know.
Right.
So it's alarming to think that any of us could be taken down and basically voices completely silenced because they were associated with someone who was doing something that something like a teachers union didn't like.
Right. And it's interesting, we touched on this the other day, but I think most people don't use Twitter. And
Right.
and we were just talking about how if you don't use Twitter and you haven't used it extensively enough to understand what it is and how it works, right? Because the big social media sites go, Twitter is the one that has the steepest learning curve. Like you don't just immediately create an account and get it, right? You have to become involved in a neighborhood of Twitter to really understand how it works and how all the relationships connect and all that. But you were make the point you were making about the importance of Twitter for our larger culture, even though as social media networks go, it's the smallest probably.
What the part about it being like an intellectual space, or it being like how it affects the culture?
How it affects the culture.
Yeah, I was talking to a friend about this the other day. She has an anonymous, like very small account on Twitter that she just basically is on there to read and not really engage. But people who are not on Twitter, they don't, like you said, they don't understand Twitter. They don't know the point of Twitter. But Twitter is really where ideas are being cultivated, tested, to see what kind of response people will give. It's a really great place to vet ideas. And what's happening on Twitter, it makes its way into the culture, whether people realize it or not. And I remember when all the like anti-racism stuff and the CRT and all that stuff was happening big on Twitter, it had not really gotten into public discourse at that point, like outside of Twitter. It was all happening there. And then, sure enough, it starts showing up in public discourse. And now, on the news, you can hear about things that started on Twitter, moved out into the culture.
Yeah, it's interesting. Back in probably early 2015, excuse me, that's the COVID. Probably back.
Need some tea? I got some tea.
What kind is it?
It's ginger.
That's
I don't know if that will help.
Well, ginger's good for you. Lowers your inflammation.
I just have the tea.
Have you ever tried to eat crystallized ginger?
Yes, I did, and it was terrible. I regret that decision.
I've got some. Maybe in a minute I'll take a break and go get some.
Okay.
So in like 2015, before you were on Twitter, I remember like the first few. I remember the first few days when I heard, guys were on Twitter starting to talk about Donald Trump as possibly, getting the Republican nomination, and at that point I was like, no way, that can't possibly happen. And obviously, we know what happened, right? But it's just interesting because, and obviously Twitter was a huge part of the Trump presidency, but it was a huge part of the Trump presidency because, certainly in the circles of Twitter that I read, his candidacy was taken very seriously there before it was taken seriously anywhere else. Excuse me again. And that's that's kind of the example of what we're talking about, right? Like the sharpest, most prescient, insightful people in our cultural dialogue now are on Twitter, right? And so to be banned from Twitter is more than just, it's not like Facebook is telling you can't post what you had for breakfast. It's much
right. It's like it's preventing you from like personal growth, I suppose, if that's what you go there for. And I've made many friendships, like real friendships there, friendships with people that I've met in person. And it feels, and you don't think about being taken down as someone who posts about, tea and bunnies and baking and the occasional, maybe somewhat fiery education tweet, which still, I think even then it's pretty mild compared to a lot of people. I didn't think about being taken down, so I didn't have connection to anybody really. I just had a few people's contact, maybe like less than 10.
Right.
And so it's been kind of a scramble to get in touch with people that I want to get in touch with, or who have tried to get in touch with me. Thankfully, Chalkboard was able to filter some people through and get my contact information out to them. And I've been in touch with some. Some of them I'm connected with, like on another social media platform, and we were able to connect there. But it does, it just it's a punishment, it's an isolation, lots of consequences beyond just like you're not on social media.
Right. Yes. And so, speaking of Twitter, one of the first things I noticed about your feed was many months ago now, you had a tweet about coziness and I thought, I'd never read anyone who used the notion of coziness as a kind of a value category, right? Except for me, right? I'd often thought in those terms as well. And I think I may have responded to that. That maybe have been one of our first interactions. Do you remember what you said?
I think it was in like I think it was about like women, that women just always want to be cozy or something like that. I can't even remember the tweet, but I remember it being like that's a high value for us. We just want to be cozy.
Yeah. And so that was one of the things we were going to talk about today is coziness. And I don't know, at some point, it probably wasn't right then, but I brought up to you my observation that we actually are living in the middle of a war on coziness, right? And a cultural war on coziness and hostility to it. But when you say cozy, what do you mean?
Well, when I say cozy, which it may be different than how you think of cozy, but when I think of cozy, it's just a sense of peacefulness and warmth and security, and also something, your surroundings, or something that produces a sense of nostalgia, a sense of longing, for something more eternal, for something transcendent. That's how I think of cozy.
Yes. So let me see if I can break it down. You break down.
Yes, please do. Please do. I'm going to sip my tea while you do that.
All right. And then I think, see if you don't agree with this, at least 3 components. Coziness requires a sense of fulfilled need, right? Like you want to say the thing about the gas, right? Like you can't be cozy if.
Right. My mom and I were talking about coziness last night, and she was like, you know what's not cozy? When gas is so expensive, you don't know if you can get enough to go somewhere we need to go. Inflation is not coziness.
Right. So inflation is not cozy because coziness requires a sense of met need, right? And so you have to have at least reduced anxiety about whether your needs are going to be met. Okay, and this is what your mom is saying. So you can't be cozy if you don't think you can go to the doctor tomorrow because
or buy your groceries or whatever. Yeah.
There's also, I think, a scale issue in coziness. So then when you think of being cozy, right? Nobody thinks of being cozy standing in the middle of an interstate highway interchange of 6 lanes of traffic.
Right. I would never post a picture of a 4-lane and be like, isn't this so cozy?
Cozy, right. Yeah. Because those things are built beyond all human scale. So I avoid interstate travel as much as possible.
Right.
But recently I was on a trip and I drove the interstate, and just reflecting on it, right? It's part of the issue when you drive on the interstate is its enormity. And it's just incredible to me that so many people are accustomed, without even thinking about it, to sitting in a metal box that's moving at 75 miles an hour, right? Surrounded by other metal boxes that are even bigger, barreling along this strip of concrete, you know, that is enormous.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because it's beyond all human scale, as opposed to when you think, okay, you can think of a cozy road, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Mm-hmm.
let's say a red dirt road in Georgia somewhere, right?
Oh, I know about that.
Or a little tree-lined country lane in rural England.
Mm-hmm.
These images come to mind when we think, well, what would a cozy road look like? They look
Yeah.
like that. And the reason is because they are at a manageable scale that does not dwarf our own sense of our humanness.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Whenever I have the Rona, just feel free to talk.
Okay, I'm totally okay with that.
Excuse me.
I understand. I can relate.
Mhm. All right. So, um,
I
and
was
that,
going to say something whenever you finish up.
well, you just go ahead
Are you finished?
for
Are
now,
you done now?
not completely.
Well,
I'll move
well,
on.
because you and I, because going back to like the whole car thing and the human scale thing, you and I talked a little bit a couple weeks ago about, um, it's not that cars are like, it's not that they're not virtuous. It that they can be used for virtuous ends or not virtuous ends.
Mhm.
What was it we talked about? I feel like this is like
That
something.
they aren't, that a car is, well, that there's a certain neutrality to the car.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And I would say that's about roads too.
Hmm.
Would you say that about roads?
Well, I mean, I would say roads are useful, right? Um, insofar as they are a helpful aid to worthwhile ends. So, I mean, I'm very glad that we have a road between my house and the hospital, right? Um, and so there, but a road, of course, doesn't necessarily imply mechanized travel. I mean, people can take horses, people can walk on a road, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and in terms of like a car being neutral, all technologies imply a certain set of values, right? Like, so the car necessarily implies valuing that you value movement and speed and sort of the diminishing role of space in your life, right? Because that's what a car is. It's a machine for reducing space. And so they all have a set of values that they imply, but I don't think those values are necessarily dominating in the sense that if you have a car, those values somehow must necessarily take over your life or whatever. But
I'm
you're
sorry,
all
I veered us off of coziness. I'm sorry.
right. Well, but you're all, but with all technologies, if you want to use them, you have to make a conscious decision if you want to use them kind of counter to their own implied value system. Do you understand? Is that too abstract?
No, that's good. No, it's good.
So, but the point, but it's not entirely separated from the idea of coziness because because most of our lived space now, certainly our public spaces, are essentially designed for cars
Mm-hmm.
rather than for the human body, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're not
Correct.
designed for the walker,
Mm-hmm.
and so that sense of human scale is just further and further obliterated from our public design.
I think that when I think of coziness too, I think about it that it somehow connects us to reality
Mm.
more than a car would.
What do you mean?
Like, okay, like I'm thinking about how I said one time that that a dragon is more real than a car, and I couldn't explain that,
Mm-hmm.
but that it was.
Mm-hmm.
And there's something about a dragon that connects us to reality that a car cannot do. Even though a car is part of creation, and it's not part of creation like big C creation.
Mm-hmm.
It's part of creation because the creaturely created a car.
Right.
Okay, I'm sorry. I'm gonna just edit all this out because it's terrible.
So, but the dragon is organic, right? And so part of what we think of, I think, when we think about coziness too, is there is an aesthetic element, okay? Because so I think it is scale. It is what was the first thing I said? Met needs, scale, and there's an aesthetic element. And that aesthetic element is directly related to what you were talking about when you said it connects you to, it gives you a sense of nostalgia and it connects you to the eternal, right? Is that it's in that aesthetic, it's the beauty of that environment that connects you transcendently beyond the moment. I think this is, and that's why designed spaces, built environments that that encourage you to only be in the moment are never cozy. So if you are in a big box department store, it's not cozy. And the reason is because everything in there is designed to make you forget that you have a future.
Yes, right. It is so much about the temporal and the eternal. Yes. I mean, I think that what you said earlier, people know cozy when they see it. They're not going to look at, like you said, a 6-lane highway or even a car or something. Oh, can you hear me okay? Okay. And think, oh, that's so cozy. But they're going to look at a fireplace and a warm cup of tea or a lane with trees lining it as cozy.
Right. Because and we have like an inherent recognition of that kind of thing. Which in my mind implies that we're made for it. Right? That we are drawn to things that we're made for, and we are at some level either repulsed or ambivalent about things that we use but don't love. I suppose that's an element of coziness too, right? Is that no one is ever cozy in an environment that he cannot love.
Right. But I think that is tied to the nostalgia. Like you can't have a sense of longing for something that you don't love.
Right. And so like, I mean, but nobody loves the interstate highway system. Nobody loves what, like the craft aisle at Target or whatever.
Right.
These are all, nobody loves that. Nobody's, nobody in their most despairing moments thinks, oh my gosh, if I could only get on the interstate and go buy some magic markers at Target.
I mean, some people think that.
Okay, if you're a person who thinks that, and
it's because because what we're going to talk about later, it's because you're a zombie.
Oh yeah, that okay, yes. So anyway, there's war on coziness. That's the other. Yes. That's where all this is leading, right? You want to describe that, or you want me to talk about it?
I think you should start talking about that. I feel like you have a better grasp of kind of what that means.
Well, I think the war on coziness is really a war on our humanness, right? That we live in an anti-human in society that where our elite values certainly constantly try to push us beyond human scale. And you see this everywhere, right? Like the emphasis on bigness. I remember years ago, I wrote a tweet where I was kind of talking about the difference in American politics between at that time between liberals and conservatives. And conservatives were always saying the problem is big government at that time, and liberals were saying the problem is big business, and I was saying the problem is actually bigness. And so elite values are always pushing us toward bigness, and bigness is inherently anti-cozy because it is beyond the human scale. James Howard Kunstler, I remember many years ago in his book called The Geography of Nowhere, he talks about both human scale, but he also talks about, in terms of design, the human need to be enclosed, right? Like, so that human beings love walled gardens,
Mm-hmm.
right? And what we don't love is we don't love it, the 8-lane interstate highway, because there's no enclosure, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's just exposed. We're just exposed and all that. And so if you're going to have enclosure of any kind, that implies a limit to size,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? But you also see kind of the war on coziness in the way that we're pushed toward other kinds of bigness.
Mm-hmm.
So we are pushed to leave home and go as far away as possible to the biggest college we can go to.
Mm-hmm.
We are all encouraged to have an attitude toward relationships that assumes that the more of them you have, the better,
Mm-hmm.
right? And for most basic example, we are all encouraged, for example, to watch as many television shows as you could possibly fit into your
Mm-hmm.
life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so the kind of the push toward never-ending increase
Mm.
is a part of this sort of psyop against coziness, I think.
No, I agree. I feel like I don't have much more to add. I think that you articulated it so well.
The what seems cozy to you?
Like just in general, winter, even though it's cold.
Yeah, tell me why, because that's important.
Well, winter, I don't know. I just think that like inside of winter is a fire and warmth and cozy foods
Mhm.
and sweaters and soft blankets and um it's I mean maybe that's just a personal preference. Someone else might think that summer is cozy.
Well,
Um
but the hostility of the weather in winter, right, emphasizes how well your needs are met inside,
mm,
right? So that it creates a contrast
mm.
that you feel.
What's cozy to you?
Well, I mean, all the same things. I mean, the environment. But when I think about coziness, I think particularly, uh, eh,
You're gonna go like some like really up here. I'm like a fire, tea, some warm blankets, and you're gonna say something
all
like
right. Shall we talk about the roles that we've adopted? That like part of the reason you are here is so that I can actually relate to other people, right? Um,
I'm gonna dumb it down for everybody.
well, that's not the thing, but
It's true.
here's the way to say. All right, we're getting off on another tangent, but I am about as introverted as a person can be, and you are not.
I'm about as extroverted as a person can be.
So my orientation is always toward ideas and inner life or whatever, and so I brought you here so you can actually connect me to other people.
Okay, great.
So
Just send your message into the world.
right, you act as a buffer.
Mhm.
Um, oh, we should talk at some point about personality too.
Oh yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
oh, but in terms of coziness, so here's a great example. I
Mhm.
often so my quintessential picture of coziness comes from the novels of Miss Reed. I've tweeted about those before. Miss Reed was this woman who lived in England for most of the 20th century. I think she died maybe like 2004, and she wrote a two series of novels. So over the course of her life, she probably wrote 30 novels. Um, and almost all of them are either set in the village of Thrush Green or in the village of Fairacre. And the Thrush Green novels in particular draw a fantasy picture of English village life, even in the 1990s.
Mhm.
But they emphasize smallness in a way that I think cuts right to the heart of what we mean when we talk about coziness. And so those novels, I think, are in that sense anti-modern
Mm.
in the way that they emphasize smallness, because I mean, Thrush Green is a very small place, and the conflicts in the novel are very small. They all take place, so there's an entire novel that revolves around the question of who's going to clean up the graveyard.
Oh.
Uh,
That's-
but yeah, I think they, those novels sort of hit on and describe this a life lived at human scale.
Do you think that Twitter creates coziness or more atomization?
I think it does both, actually, right? I mean, you and I would not be here having this conversation. We're not, if it weren't for Twitter.
Mhm.
I think, a lot of Twitter, okay, I've written about this before too. A lot of Twitter is your Twitter timeline and its effect on you is really a reflection of you, right? Because
Mhm.
you literally followed all those people, and you can cultivate and
Mhm.
curate your timeline. And so I think people, because you see this a lot, or used to see it more maybe, but people who use Twitter obsessively but constantly complain about Twitter,
Mm.
right? It's like, well,
Mhm.
Twitter is voluntary, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
So I think our corner Twitter actually does a good job of encouraging connection,
Mhm.
mostly because at least in my timeline, it's pretty apolitical, and I don't see a lot of infighting.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, I was just thinking about how I think I said something. I don't even know if this really pertains to what we're talking about, but I think I said something to you about this the other day. Is that Twitter has created so many long range connections. And in our community of Twitter, it's like all these long range connections
Meaning people
who are
live far
coming.
away from one another.
Right, we live far apart, but we're connected. I mean, I'm connected to people across the country. You are too, across the world. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, goodness gracious. But we're able to be connected very intimately on Twitter as friends and mutuals. So we have these long range connections, and it's interesting because, like I said, in our community, long range connections of people who long for short range connections, like they want to go basically create a community, a real life community of all their Twitter people, where
Right.
they can just live in a small little town with their Twitter community and never have to leave it.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's just interesting to think about.
Right. That they want to choose. They want Thrush Green, but they just want to choose everyone who lives there.
Right. Correct. Yes.
Right.
So.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And so that the question there of like individual choice and all of that raises many questions too, like in terms of kind of the organic community life, right? I mean, it's the organic community life, like in a place like Thrush Green, a British village where you were born and lived your life. Part of its defining feature is that you don't choose all the people who live there with you, right? And so in that sense, Twitter is like the opposite of a real community, in that you choose your relationships from among the millions of available options, as opposed to being forced into a situation where you are limited geographically, etc., and therefore kind of have to accept those limits. And accepting limits is a part of coziness.
Is Twitter consumeristic?
Is it consumeristic?
Like if we're able to go to Twitter and choose, like if we're able to go to Twitter and just choose from all the people who we want in our community of Twitter, is that playing to our consumerism?
Yeah, to a certain degree, I think it is. I mean, I think that the underlying ideology of, you come here and you choose from among these millions of options, and then you literally don't have to do anything. You can just sit and scroll with your thumb, and there will be people who provide a material for you to consume, right? So it's like I was saying with the car, these technologies, they have their inherent set of underlying values, but I don't think those underlying values are necessarily total, in the sense that you can't use these technologies in ways that are contrary to the set of values that they imply. So like you can build real community on Twitter, even though it's biased against it. Right? Just like you can own a car and mostly stay at home, even though the car itself is biased toward leaving.
Right.
Right. I feel like I'm doing all the talking.
No, it's good. I feel like you can talk more about this stuff than I can. I just sit here and learn.
All right. So what do you think about zombies?
Well, you know how I feel about it. So I was in my whole thing about zombies. I never watched The Walking Dead. I didn't watch that show.
I only watched 8 seasons.
Oh, okay. I never watched that show. I mean, I think I've watched maybe 2 episodes ever. I just for whatever reason couldn't get into it. But I know lots of people who love it. And when I was in a microbiology class years and years ago, we were learning about prions. And I tweeted about this once. That prions they're attributed to mad cow disease. So it's basically these things that infect your brain and make you go crazy. And that's what I think has happened to the culture, is that people have been infected with these prions and they are unable to think for themselves at all. There's nothing anchoring them. They have no developed worldview. And so they're very susceptible to becoming just zombies to whatever the culture puts in front of them.
And I mean, obviously the prion is a metaphor, right?
Correct. Right. It's not really happening. Right. There's not some real thing that's it's infecting people's brains.
It's an interesting idea to think about, like, what's the prion a metaphor for?
I suppose.
Really
go ahead. No, go ahead. What do you think?
Causes zombification?
Pardon?
I said, what really causes zombification?
Well, I wrote a whole thread about that. It's public education, exposure to media from a very early age, just being in front of a screen, being completely unmoored from the transcendent and virtue. I'm trying to remember that thread. Honestly, I can't remember everything I said. Like the idea that everybody needs to go to college and have massive amounts of debt to go to a college, get a degree they can't use, and get a job that they hate and do fake work. And just all those things piled on, for 30 years, you're susceptible to being infected with this prion. You're weak. Basically, you're weakened to the point of being susceptible to influence, whether you realize it or not.
You're raised to be weak, right? You're weakened from the moment you begin. The can you tell the story about the TikTok videos and the kid who was like couldn't do it?
Oh yeah. So I had you and I were talking this the other day. So I have a kid that I see on a regular basis, and I see him every week. And he has a lot of behavioral needs. He has a lot of he had trouble with impulse control, becoming easily dysregulated and having to re-regulate. And so we're just working through all that. And he will pick a desk up and throw a chair, be aggressive, be AWOL, and just leave the classroom, that kind of thing. And it's usually whenever a demand is placed on him that he doesn't want to do, or he's doing a test or doing a task that really requires him to focus and think about something, and he becomes frustrated. Very, very bright. He and I, we get along great. We have great conversations.
When he's not
Pardon?
I said when he's not throwing a desk.
Right. He's never thrown a desk at me ever. The only thing he's ever done with me is lay down on the floor and refuse to move and say he's going to lay there until he dies. That's the only thing he's ever done with me. Yeah. He's never been aggressive toward me or anything. So he had thrown a desk a couple of days prior to me seeing him, and I said, so what was going on whenever you threw that desk? Like, what is happening? And he said, well, I was just trying to do my math test, and all of these TikTok videos were coming into my head, and all these TikTok memes were just filling up my head. And he goes, I was trying to concentrate on the math, but I couldn't concentrate on the math because my mind was just so full of these videos and memes that I couldn't get them out. And I was getting so frustrated. And he goes, and then I just left the class. I threw the desk and then I just left the classroom. And he said, but then I had lunch and had a little bit of a break. And then I came back and I finished the test, no problem. But he really struggles to get these images out of his mind enough to concentrate. He said they just pop up, and that's really common for kids to say things like that. He just has a really extreme reaction to that when other children don't.
It's like that's like the zombification process in real time, right?
Yes.
I guess when we talk about zombies, what we really mean.
Oh, can I say one more thing?
Yeah, please.
Oh, I was going to say one more thing. Something else that I hear from kids who are how I perceive as like in part of the zombification process is what also is contributing to that is their time in the classroom, in the school.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they don't really have an understanding of the benefits of like why anybody would even go to school or be educated or what the purpose is or anything like that. And they will say things like, I just don't want to be at this school. So I think and so often the screen is used in the classroom now. So they are just never escaping like a screen and images. And demands are being placed on them, tasks are being assigned, and they don't understand the reason. And I don't understand the reason many times. Like, I can't tell you why we're doing it this way or why this is happening. And so put children through 13 years of that. And now with standards being so low, I talked about this with Rubes, standards being so low, many are coming out functionally illiterate. Mm-hmm. And then they're just even more frustrated when they get into broader society. And by the time they're 30, they are just zombies.
Yeah, just a story to illustrate that. For many years, about a dozen years, I was a university professor, and I taught different kinds of media studies classes. And very early on, probably a decade ago now, I was teaching an old book about the influence of media in our society. And it was written, and it probably came out in the mid 90s. So it was older by then, but it was written probably it's written for the general reader. So I think that means it's probably written at what we consider like an 8th grade reading level. Mm-hmm. And I had a student come in, and we were in the classroom alone, and he said, well, Dr. Abbott, I can't read this book. And I said, what do you mean you can't read the book? Why can't you read the book? And he said, well, he said, I can read it, I guess, but like, I can't understand what he's saying. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it took me a moment to kind of grasp what I was hearing. And like, finally I understood that what the kid was saying was that he can sit down and look at the words, but he cannot process the meaning. Like, he can't, he couldn't read a paragraph and understand that it was an argument about something. Mm-hmm. Right. And certainly you can't read a chapter and understand that chapter consists of an argument and evidence, right? He can't keep that in his mind. He can't follow it linguistically. And at that point, I realized, oh, I see why university teaching is so difficult. It's because a majority of these students are essentially functionally illiterate. And I just simply define functionally illiterate as able to read, but not able to read in a way that actually achieves an end. Right. He couldn't sit down and read a book and learn something from it because he can't.
I would say, oh, I'm sorry.
No, he can't process it. That's all I was gonna say.
Right. And I would say, we live in a culture that values entertainment. I mean, the children that I talk to, they do not aspire to be the things that you and I probably aspire to be, teachers or doctors or lawyers or,
I wanted to be a hobo for a long time.
Oh yeah, you wanted to be a hobo. That's right. That's right. I never wanted to be a hobo. I didn't have that draw to homelessness. But most of the kids that I talk to, their aspirations are, I want to be a YouTube star. I want to be an influencer. I want to have TikTok videos, that kind of thing. And they're just so drawn to entertainment and that dopamine hit of being kind of rewarded for the content you produce. So none of them are thinking about, they don't think, if you're doing something like that, they don't think that you need to learn to read to do something like that. You just turn your camera on, whatever. But we are not the first. This is not the first time in history that a culture has been manipulated. A society has been manipulated to or by entertainment. You and I said this the other day, before there was TikTok, there was bread and circuses.
Sure.
And kind of mind numbing a whole society in order to control them and for, basically to make them do your bidding.
Right. Well, I think what we should say what we mean actually when we talk about zombification and what a zombie is. And I think this is what you mean, and this is what I mean, is that, excuse me again. I mean that we live in a culture where the consciousness of the majority of people is 100% conformed to the dominant narrative. Right? And that so the difference between us and ancient Rome, where they had bread and circuses, okay, is that we live in a narrativized society, culture, in a way that is total. So because you have such access to media, that means the narrative has total and constant access to you. And so from the time we are born, we are kind of indoctrinated into the dominant narrative. And so now where we are is in a situation where the dominant narrative is such that the majority of people are so identified with it that they don't even realize they're in a narrative.
Right. They think going to Target in the arts and crafts aisle is good and fun. They don't realize that is being a zombie.
It's not right. So that's the other point, right? Is that their consciousness is so totally conformed, collapsed into the narrative, right? That their behavior, they don't understand, is programmed.
Correct.
I know Wendell Berry, and he I don't know if you know well enough his little poem called Mad Farmer Liberation Front. Do you know that poem?
I don't think so. I think it's in my collection though.
It is, and I'm sure it's in your collection. But there is a I'm
like looking for it. I'm like, where?
Do you have it handy? If not, I'll just quote it.
Give me a second. Let me see. I don't know. I reread some of my books recently, and I don't know where it is.
All right. So, okay. So in the poem, he says something like, "Love the regular paycheck and the yearly vacation. Want more of everything ready made, and when they want you to kill or die, they will let you know." Something like that.
That's very good.
It's not a perfect recollection, but it's something like that. And what the point he's making is that he's complaining about the sort of programmatic behavior of the sort of the average person in a mediated society, that they will, and it's, it's just like the build up to a war in Ukraine, right? So that we are, just sort of being programmed to accept killing and dying in that way. Right. And so, but anyway, so the process of zombification is just what you were describing, sort of being reared into it.
Let me ask you a question. What is the difference in, or how can we tie together like a psyop and zombification? Like, is there a way to like tie those together?
Oh, I think 100%. I mean, you've read Gatto, right?
Oh, yeah.
So, his whole thesis essentially is that the public school system is designed to create zombies.
Right.
I don't think he didn't use that word, but
right. And what's interesting is people will say, "Oh, I don't read him because he's conspiratorial." Whatever, that's fine. But I think that he understands what 13 years in that system does to a person, that that conditions them in a way, that robs them in a way. I think he understands that. I remember one time I was watching an interview with him. I read a couple of his books, and I've been a fan of him for probably 15 years. But he was saying, whenever you send your children to public school, and I work in a public school, my children have gone to public school, but I have a very, what should I say about it?
You have an understanding.
Yes.
Right? You have a non-zombified understanding of what's happening.
Public education, right? And we can go into my kids being in public school another time. It's a whole other story and topic. But he said, when you send your children to school, you are sending them there for 7 hours a day, 13 years of their life, for strangers to work on their minds.
Strangers who are consumed by the dominant narrative.
Yes, people who are consumed by the dominant narrative. I mean, especially now, so many activist teachers at this point. I mean, every teacher is an activist before they're a teacher. Everybody is. I mean, the only people at my school that are not activist teachers are the older ones. When I say older, I mean like my age and older.
Right. I'm sure it'll seem that way to me when I get
everybody older than 40.
Right.
They are the only ones who are, I think, still teaching and not being activists. But pretty much anyone under the age of 30 that's new and fresh out of school, teachers college, they are activists first and teachers second.
When I talk about people under 30, I just like to say my generation.
You and I, we're a generation. Are we a generation apart?
Well,
I don't know what is a generation. How many is that? 20 years? We're not 20 years.
Well, no, because I'm 11 years older than you, right? So I would think of a generation like I would have to be old enough to be your father.
Okay, so like 20 years.
Right. Yeah, something like that. So,
but just back to public school being like probably the primary mechanism for zombification. Like that's probably where it's mostly occurring now, and maybe for the last 100 years has been where it's occurred. And I just always, I get on my soapbox about public education and or just education in general, and that's like my thing to talk about. But it's an experiment.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's what frustrates me so much about it, is that it's always been an experiment. And when you look back on the history of education in America and you unpack all the different methods that have been applied, there was a whole time in the late 50s, early 60s or mid 60s that they weren't teaching phonics. And you had this whole generation of kids who cannot sound out words, who can't, not only are they functionally illiterate, they like literally can't read or sound out a word. And they were taught a whole language approach to reading. And my dad was taught that. Mm-hmm. Like my dad was a whole language learner. And even though he reads all the time, he struggles with a lot of words because he never learned phonics. And he has to do a lot of, reading the text around the word that he doesn't know or can't sound out so he can figure it out, what it actually means. And my mom was the same way. She had a whole language approach, but she was in a kindergarten classroom as a teacher's aide for many years and learned phonics being in that class. And so she would go home and try to help my dad. She'd be like, look, Tommy, this is an A. And it goes, ah, ah, ah. And she would like try to teach my dad phonics when he was like 50 years old,
Right.
So that was really funny. But it still is an experiment on children. Public education is a government-sponsored experiment on children.
Right. I think that's the point. That's the central point from Gatto. I guess I should say we're talking about John Taylor Gatto, who was a former New York State Teacher of the Year.
Yeah, multiple. He was multiple, like New York City and New York State Teacher of the Year in the early 90s.
Mm-hmm. And who in the years since his retirement has written.
He passed away though, I think, didn't he?
I don't know if he's still
alive. I think he passed away.
In the years after his retirement, he wrote several books criticizing the structure of public education. Do you have them all here?
This book right here, this like monster of a book. This was the book. It took me like a long time to get through this because obviously it's like a textbook almost.
Right.
And there's he has so many notes. I mean, like, oh my goodness gracious, like it's so well cited. And I just think that's a really important book for people to read if they want to understand the history of American education. Say what you want to about him being, conspiratorial about education. I think it's really clear. I think a solid case can be made for it being an experiment.
Well, to say something is conspiratorial is not the same as saying it's not true.
That's true. We're starting now to see a lot of people who said conspiratorial things a year ago are now being vindicated.
Right. I saw a meme or something not long ago that said, today's conspiracy theory is next week's news.
Yes, it's true. It's true. Right. And public education has just been this like, is golden calf the right? It's been like this.
Sacred cow.
Yeah, sacred cow. Golden calf. Please edit that out.
Yeah,
sacred cow.
It's the same thing.
I know, you know what I'm talking about. People, you know what I'm talking about. Okay.
You're just using the more obscure literary reference.
So yeah, the sacred cow, like nobody, it's just what we've done for all these years. And I will get on I wish I could stand up in this chair, but I'd probably fall out of it. Like stop being taken captive by these ideas that this is how it's supposed to be. Like it's not. And I think that we could say, and because I know we probably need to wrap this up pretty soon, the closer you are to coziness, the farther away, right. The farther you are from zombification.
Right. So, but before I just want to make this point about the education thing, is that, and this is Gatto's, one of his, I think, central points, is that the structure of public education is not an accident. Right? That literally kids are put through 6 or 7 periods a day on purpose to prevent them, for example, to prevent them from developing their individual interests, and using their time based on that. That's the whole point. And so the structure, and that's important because it extends beyond it, because people might think, oh, well, they're talking about the content of the dominant narrative, but it's not just the content, it's the structure of our society that reinforces a kind of collapsing of consciousness into it. And I guess what I mean when I say a collapsing of consciousness into the narrative, I mean an inability to separate oneself psychically from what you're told in order to step back and have any critical distance from what you are told.
Differentiate yourself.
Right, to use the Bowenian term.
Yes, we'll have to talk about that on another show. Like, we've got so many things like we could really talk about, and people may like not want to be. They may not care anything about our conversation. Like,
this podcast may end up having 2 listeners.
Yes, just
you and I.
Yeah, but that's okay because we just have a lot of things to talk about. Right. But yeah, I think it's that self-differentiation. I mean, Bowen talks about differentiation from like an emotional, rational perspective. His self-differentiation is related to how you respond to anxiety. Like an anxious person, are you able to engage with a person who is not as differentiated as you are, but remain autonomous in your own response? Are you able to rationalize the situation? And same thing, it's like what you're talking about. Can you differentiate your thinking from the narrative?
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, and so yes, we probably should wrap up. I don't know how long we've been talking, but it's been,
I think, like an hour-ish.
More than an hour, probably. But
I'm just plugging in my laptop because I'm gonna be running out of battery here in a minute.
Okay. So, yes, I was going to tie these 2 things together just the way you did, to say that the war on coziness is part of the zombification process.
Yes.
Right. Especially because if you think about it, there is a kind of subtle shaming that goes on culturally around the desire to be cozy, especially, and we didn't even pursue this, but especially the notion that women in particular all just want to be cozy. But if you are a person who,
and small,
right,
SMOL,
right,
which is different than like little.
The women just want to be small.
Yes.
But if you are a person who intentionally pursues a cozy life, which means a small life, right, a limited life, you will encounter pretty much relentless, subtle shaming culture, right? Because to do that means that you are not fully zombified, because you clearly have some critical distance from the dominant narrative.
I want to say, I think growing up, I didn't have I couldn't conceive of these things that we're talking about. I didn't have an awareness. My consciousness was was collapsed, part of the narrative.
To your location, right? To your school, to your family, to what you were doing, right?
Right. But like I look back and I think my parents, whether they realized it or not, were fighting the war on coziness again, or fighting the war.
They were defending coziness.
Right. And I didn't even realize it, and I have realized it now as I've gotten older.
Right. They were teaching you values that were counter to the dominant narrative.
Correct. And it took me a long time to understand that that's what they were doing. And I don't even know that they were doing it intentionally. I think it was just, they had just a deep sense of things and values, and those just kind of were lived out and expressed just without them even having to be intentional about it.
Right, right. And so, like, I mean, this is one of the things that I said at the beginning. We've discovered that we have many similar kinds of formative experiences. And I'm from Indiana, but we're both from small places, born to working class people. I'm a
My
little.
parents didn't go to college. Did your parents go to college? No,
No,
my parents didn't go to college.
no. And I mean, obviously, I'm, a few years behind you in terms of age, but or wait, no, I came up ahead of you. I'm a child of the 80s.
Right.
But I think the reason that we're sitting here being able to have this conversation about zombification and the war on coziness is really from the beginning. We are failures of the zombification process, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, not to say we haven't been influenced by it, but from the beginning, for both of us, we were in a way insulated from that that the zombification process,
right?
By countervailing forces that were active in our lives. Yes.
Yeah. So, and I was going to say, I think if we had like lots and lots of time, we could talk about kind of when the war on coziness began, and we could probably trace it back to modernity.
Right. Sure. Well, what it is, it's the war on coziness is
expansion.
Right. It's an arena of the war, of the larger imperialism of modernity.
Yes.
Right. All right. Well, I suppose we should wrap it up because it's gone long, and we've said a lot of outrageous things.
So outrageous. Again, I don't know if people even care about this conversation. I think it's interesting.
You and I can be found on Twitter at Dean Abbott. Is there any way for people to reach you if they want to yell at you?
Well, I have a Going Godward email account. I don't know if should I say that? I mean, it's not.
Do you want people to use it?
I mean, if people want to, I don't check it very often, but people are welcome to send messages there. But it's Going Godward 1, like the number 1 at gmail.com.
All right, great. But you may be back on Twitter by the time this.
I'm hoping that by the time this is released, I'll be back on Twitter. Who knows?
Okay. Well, we're aiming for a couple of days. So.
Yeah. Right. So maybe by the time this is published.
Thanks for doing this.
Thank you.
I've never had a bad conversation with you.
I've never had a bad conversation with you. I'm sorry if you hear some background noise. It's my dog snoring.
Right. Well, next time you'll have to bring her closer to the mic.
She's pretty close right now. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll talk soon.
Okay. Okay. Bye.